Hello and welcome to Politics. Today I'm Farrukh Pitafi. Today I want to start with a picture. A picture that you are just going to see on the screen. A picture of Captain Sikandar Sohail. A young man of 27 years. He embraced Shahadat. He embraced martyrdom, was killed a couple of days ago in an operation that went on in Tank. The question now is that this didn't happen 2 months ago, 3 months ago, when the war in Afghanistan was going on. This young, beautiful man died now. Why so? The war in Afghanistan might be over, but the 20-year war against terrorism continues still in Pakistan. And given that this kind of activities we still keep on fighting, Pakistan has been sacrificing all along 80,000 citizens. And I tell you one thing for sure, when I was coming here, I checked with the various sources, and the fact is that this number, 80,000 Pakistanis who have died in fighting terrorism, they don't even include our intelligence operatives who were fighting or were somehow embedded or were actually there out in open fighting terrorism. This sacrifice has continued. $150 billion is a conservative estimate of how much we lost in money, the loss that was there to exchequer. Yesterday and day before yesterday, when we were hearing, we were watching the congressional hearings, the numbers that were given there, particularly about the Americans who were killed in 20 years war, particularly the soldiers, the number amounted to 2,400. But there are other numbers which are quite intriguing, and one needs to actually mention them as well. According to Watson Institute of Brown University, India, Afghanistan and Pakistan have lost over 200,000 civilians, not merely combatants, but civilians. And when you look at all these numbers, you realize that there must be some kind of appreciation for whatever the country Pakistan has been doing. Remember, before 9/11, there was hardly any activity of terrorism, any attack on Pakistani security forces. But now you see that terrorism hasn't gone away. And yet the country that actually convinced Pakistan to participate in this war still doesn't see our sacrifices. That becomes a problem, because then when you talk about American image, and yesterday and day before yesterday, everyone was asking General Milley, Secretary of Defense and other officials whether it was any negative, it had any negative impact on the US image all over the world, the withdrawal. They were agreeing. And this image question is a big one. So think about the image of the US in a country that has over 200 million people and who have been facing all these troubles throughout these years. Today we are going to talk about one, the sacrifices of Pakistan, then these hearings, and of course that unfortunate and that sad bill that was introduced by 22 Republican lawmakers that actually specifically talks about sanctioning Pakistan. And why is it that the US hardly ever pays heed to whatever Pakistan has been saying? We are going to talk about all these matters in order to help us understand these issues and to explain to us what can be done to ensure that Pakistan's concerns are heard internationally, particularly the country for whom we have done so much. I'm joined by Brigadier retired Salim Kamar Sahab, who is a senior analyst, also writes as well. Thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program. Michael Kugelman joins us from Washington, D.C. He is not only an expert on this region, but a friend of this region as well, and he is working for Wilson Center. Thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program. Jahangir Khattak Sahab also joins us from New York, who is a senior analyst and is going to explain these matters to us. Thank you very much, Khattak Sahab, for being part of the program. With your permission, gentlemen, I have to start with the studio. Brigadier Sahab, at this moment, the war on terror hasn't stopped in Pakistan. You yourself are a soldier. Your family, entire family is of soldiers. Your son is still deputed in a conflict zone. How do you feel when Pakistan mention only comes when there is complaint about, you have to air complaints?
Right, it has always been like that, Farrukh, for the last 20 years, even when we were actively supporting the US and its allies in Afghanistan in whatever way they asked us to do that. We did everything for them, but they never stopped scapegoating Pakistan. So this was always on the card that when they would get out from here and the scrutiny has to be done when they go back home. You know, I refer to this bill. The name of the bill is very telling for me. It is Afghanistan, counterterrorism, oversight, and what is the last thing? Counterterrorism, oversight, and accountability.
Yeah.
You read it in reverse.
Yeah.
Accountability for failure to exercise the oversight.
Okay.
Failure to implement the right kind of counterterrorism policies and strategies. So this has to be done in reverse, not for Afghanistan, not for Pakistan, but for America and its allies. You know, they had complete mechanism in place. Every year, Special Inspector General report would be presented to the American Congress.
Yeah. Cigar reports have been there since 2008.
You know, they would always tell them the mismatch in what was being claimed and what was the reality on the ground.
Right. Right.
So having said that, Pakistan has been bearing all these accusations for a long time, despite the sacrifices that you very passionately mentioned. And I've been fighting there. I've been in tribal areas of Pakistan. I've been on Afghanistan border. Not now, right from 1982, when the Soviets were here, and when the Americans came in here. I was in the tribal areas, and now my sons are there.
Yeah.
So the point is, it is very hurting. It really hurts your feeling, it hurts your pride that the people for whom you acted as best ally, they start pointing finger at you. But let me also say that this bill that is under discussion, this has been presented by not American government, not the ruling party, but by the Republican, as you said.
The opposition party.
And it is the opposition. So opposition has, you know, many birds to kill when it comes to the political mileage that they need for the midterm election, which are due in next year, November.
Right.
Right. So it has internal factors, political factors, it has external factors.
Right. And one understands the politics that is going on. The personally disappointing bit was Mitt Romney, Senator Mitt Romney.
Right.
People who are centered, who are sane advocates of moderation, they also actually siding with this bill. But there was also some sanity yesterday, especially when we were listening to the opening statements of Chairman Adam Smith. He was, quite articulate, and at least one felt that he understood. Michael Kugelman, do you want to talk about this bill that has been tabled, and somehow in Pakistan it seems that it is deja vu time. Every time a war ends, Pakistan helps the US in turning the tide of a world order or some serious change, a challenge. In the end, Pakistan is heavily sanctioned. There was Pressler Amendment after all. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks, Farrukh, as always, for having me. I would certainly advise your Pakistani audience certainly not to get too concerned about this bill. As was just noted by the General, it was introduced by the opposition, which really sort of inherently means it's not going to go anywhere. And this is, of course, not the first time that we've had a legislation introduced like this that intends to sanction Pakistan or to take a hard line on Pakistan. You have so much legislation that's introduced every week, and much of it goes nowhere. And I have no reason to think that this one will be an exception. You know, certainly Capitol Hill has long been a place where there has been some pretty significant anti-Pakistan sentiment in Washington, and that's in part because you have elected officials that are, accountable to their constituents, and if some of these constituents are concerned about what Pakistan has done, or some of these constituents happen to advocate on Capitol Hill on behalf of a particular outcome, that will all impact the way that these elected officials think. But we really should not overstate the importance of this bill. I think it's important to keep in mind that it is a notable moment for U.S.-Pakistan relations, given that the Biden administration is undertaking a review of U.S.-Pakistan relations, which doesn't necessarily mean that, there's going to be a new policy that's going to be drastic and hard-line. But given the transitions in geopolitics, with the U.S. having left Afghanistan, I think that creates a useful opportunity for officials in the administration to think about what the relationship with Pakistan should look like after the U.S. is withdrawn from Afghanistan.
Right.
And so
I'm glad, Michael, I'm glad that you have actually mentioned this as well. Recently, a decision was taken that U.S. documents, classified documents regarding 9/11 will be declassified, and the process has begun. In these 20 years, the communication with Pakistan, the communication and the various documents, how this war unfolded, what were the arrangements. Someday they are going to be declassified also. Can one hope that it will start soon? Because then perhaps the American people can also know that half the time the policies that Pakistan was being blamed for, perhaps they were also being actually directed by the Bush administration or other administrations?
Well, I think that we've already seen a trend emerging over the last year or so. The fact that you had the so-called Afghanistan papers, or not so-called, they are the Afghanistan papers. The fact that you had all of these previously classified U.S. documents coming out showing just how badly U.S. officials had failed with their policies in Afghanistan, and now you have a book that the Washington Post journalist who had led to the release of the Afghanistan papers, he's published a book that's got more attention on this as well. So yes, I certainly hope that you have more, that this trend continues. I think it's important for accountability's sake. It's also important for democracy here in the United States. And I should say that the fact that you had two consecutive days of hearings here in Washington where very senior U.S. military and civilian officials were grilled by elected officials about all the mistakes that the U.S. made, that's certainly good for democracy as well. So to answer your question, yes, I do hope that this trend continues, because that's important, especially with the U.S. in a position where it has to reflect on what went wrong after the fact, just because the war is over from the U.S. perspective.
Absolutely. Regarding the books that have come out, one concern that I have is whatever is reported is not always, hard truth. We have seen how Bob Woodward's book actually came under discussion during the hearings, and in the end, it turned out that half of those things that were reported were slightly, if not totally, inaccurate. Let me bring in Farrukh Saab. Farrukh Saab, your take on this bill and where we are lacking in telling Pakistan's story of sacrifices to the West.
Thanks for having me on the show. I think that what Michael just mentioned, I completely agree with him, and would add that I think that there is, I would say, a bit unnecessary hype that is being created in Pakistan about this bill. I'm not sure how many people have read it. It's 57-page long document. On page 25 and 26 is the mention of Pakistan. Overall, when you read this bill, so it has 14 times the name of China. It mentions Russia's name 7 times and Pakistan 3 times.
Right.
And then it is not Pakistan specific. And then another thing.
Sorry to cut you, Farrukh Saab, how many times it praises Pakistan for its sacrifices?
Well, the bill is not meant to praise anybody. It doesn't praise even its own government. So why would it praise Pakistan or any other country? It's a legislation.
I'm sure that you have been going through all the proceedings that went on in the US in the past 20 years. Have you ever, do you recall any mention of Pakistan being actually, any positive side being mentioned in any debate? The question is not about the US. I'm asking a question about Pakistan's ability to actually agitate its own points.
Well, how much Pakistan has agitated itself? How much diplomacy have we seen in Washington on the Capitol? How much have we seen from our foreign office? And also, certainly...
And Khattak Sahab, if you recall, this was my question to you, sir.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That I was talking about the bill because you talk about my take on it. So this is what I would say. And in terms of Pakistan not being mentioned or America not being very grateful and thankful to Pakistan for the help and support that Pakistan has extended over the years, certainly is always noted. And when Pakistanis complain about it, I think they have a point. But at the same time, what I want to point out is that how much we have presented our case in the corridors of power in the U.S. If you look at our latest, diplomacy that just happened at the UN General Assembly, so I know that we did forcefully presented our case, but at the same time, what was in the headlines was that Pakistani foreign minister is advocating for Taliban. So that's what was in the in the headlines, and that's what I think hurts Pakistan, because Pakistan has to present its case, and that's where people will listen.
I'm glad, Khattak Sahab, that you are actually mentioning this. This actually brings home another point. And that is, you were saying that how much Pakistan has highlighted its own sacrifices. I'm sure that the two governments are connected. I'm sure that brilliant journalists that have been working for the US press know this region, and these sacrifices that Pakistan tendered have been in open space. They're not hidden. Do you think that a democracy needs these things to be agitated per se? I'm saying this because the foreign minister of Pakistan was not advocating for Taliban. He was advocating for stable Afghanistan, and yet the press perceived it as something else.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Yeah. When you press your points from an angle that reflects the Pakistani narrative, the problem is with our narrative. I think the Pakistani narrative has all along been pretty weak. And in many areas, sometimes even it is contradictory. And that's why people raise fingers. And one thing, whenever I have seen it at State Department and even at Pentagon, questions have come about Pakistan. And there are times when we do see some negative statements, but then we see positive statements as well. When they acknowledge that Pakistan has also suffered because of terrorism, they also acknowledge Pakistan's support. I am not here advocating for America. I am saying that while America should be more thankful to Pakistan for what it has done over the years, but at the same time, Pakistan also has to up its diplomacy when it comes to the Pakistani narrative, which I feel is missing on the Capitol or overall in the US policy circles. Because whenever there is a conversation about Pakistan,
Fair point, sir. Let me bring this discussion back to the studio. Brigadier Sahab, a lot of things have been said, so I'm not going to add any question. Do you want to respond?
I think Khattak Sahab had a point, that there is a need that we got to be more proactive in projecting our sacrifices, our contributions. Not that we have not been doing that. We have been doing that, but perhaps not as much and as effectively as should have been done. So I take that point, but having said that, let me also state, I have been representing Pakistan in United States at various forums, from State Department to Pentagon, Langley, everywhere. And people were always appreciative of what Pakistan was doing for them, what were Pakistan's sacrifices, whether publicly as a spokesperson level, we may be missing that thing, but when we sit across the table, there is a lot of appreciation. And I would draw your attention to this hearing of Lloyd Austin, Mark Milley, and Kenneth McKenzie. The concluding remark, that the feel that I get from there, that they are very appreciative of what Pakistan did for them in the last 20 years. I repeat the word of Kenneth McCann, the commander CENTCOM. He said, no, replying to a congresswoman, he said, we are not going to turn our back towards Pakistan. We aren't going to repeat that mistake. Pakistan is important for us. It will remain so. But when it came to Mark Milley, and there was some very intrusive and probing question. So he said we can discuss this in the closed discussion, but let me state here that Pakistan we cannot leave, and we have to remain engaged, because for us the air corridor that Pakistan has been providing us still remains very relevant. The counter-terrorism remains very relevant, and we will need Pakistan in order to do what we could not do in Afghanistan. He was referring to Al-Qaeda and ISK. So these are the kind of things.
No, I totally get.
Point of convergence are there.
Right, and that must be there, and I'm glad that somebody was acknowledging that Pakistan is important. Whether it is an ally or not, that should be acknowledged.
What I'm trying to say is we must not overread.
No, I know. And just to clarify, because earlier I thought that Khatak Saab was actually misreading my questions as well. Let me refresh everybody's memory, even though we live in a bizarro world now, up is down, inside is outside. But for past 20 years, I've been advocating the efficacy of Pakistan working closely with the US. And we have been, people like you and I, have come under fire for actually fighting anti-Americanism. And today one feels that because of these visuals and these statements, which might be occasionally reckless, anti-Americanism keeps finding more space. Is it not true?
You see, we have to keep a balance. There are people in America who, especially in the media, in the think tank, a lot of Pakistan bashing still goes on. And it has been going on for 21 years now.
Why?
So, because they are, for me, with my experience, they are embedded people. They have been invested. They are paid to do that.
By whom?
I wrote an article. You must have
by
seen
whom?
It. By the countries which are very hostile to Pakistan.
India.
India is, of course, on the top of the list.
Who else?
Let me keep it at a diplomatic level. Studios are not
you are not a diplomat.
Studios are not supposed to discuss all these things. But let me point out the lingo of the references. Jahangir Sahib was mentioning 3 references from Pakistan. The language, the acquisitions, and giving the potential threat what could come to Pakistan. Sanctions have not been mentioned. It's our own interpretation.
No, it was that sanction entities who are responsible. Pakistan is not mentioned, but there is this conclusion.
No, it could be potential ramification by the language. But let me say, I know American Congress. Almost every congressman or woman has a maximum Indian staffer with them. So whenever the draft are proposed, and especially by the opposition, it is the draft appears to be prepared by the Indian draftsmen.
Right. Let us not call them Indian. They are Indian Americans. They are American first.
Let's open up.
I have to take a small break.
American, but let's be frank. Let's not leave it in limbo. The language and the contents are, for me, clearly telling me who has drafted this part of the bill. 57 pages. If there is a half page written specific to Pakistan, it has to come from a country, from a party which is very hostile to Pakistan.
Right, and we are going to talk about that, sir. With your permission, I have to take a small break. When we come back, I'm going to go back to Washington and then New York as well. But first, let us take a break.
Who am I? Am I the fire that burns at a Sufi's abode, where devotees come in reverence to seek warmth for frost-bitten souls? and rekindle the flame within. They come in throngs from all directions and in all hues to stop a while, but never to stay. Who am I? Am I the willow tree that gives shade to the jaded, but does not bear fruit? So when the sun mellows into a more merciful countenance, it's time to bid adieu. Who am I?
Welcome back. Before going to the break, we were talking about this bill that has been tabled on accountability and transparency regarding Afghanistan withdrawal. And that is not all. There are aspects about Pakistan-US relations which also come under discussion. So let me read a few statements that were actually made in past 48 hours by Pakistani leaders. First of all, Shariat Rahman Saiba, Senator of Pakistan People's Party. The United States has left Afghanistan with a deal it made directly with the Taliban and is now pressing Pakistan to take responsibility for all that is happening in Afghanistan. Then, she is chairperson of the Senate Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, former Pakistan ambassador to the US. Then she goes on to say, the bill directly, and we are talking about the very bill, this bill directly targets Pakistan. Section 202 of the bill directly mentions Pakistan and calls for an assessment of support by state and non-state actors, including government of Pakistan, for the Taliban between 2001 and 2020. Then let me also read a couple of statements from Sheikh Rashid, who is Federal Minister, Federal Interior Minister. The world and Indian intelligence have faced a defeat and they should admit the reality in Afghanistan. Pakistan to fully support Afghanistan in a time of crisis. This is the Interior Minister of Pakistan. I'm told that first I'll have to go to Jahangir Khattak Saab. Jahangir Khattak Saab, you have listened to the discussion that is going on. Now, let me ask you for the recommendations regarding, telling Pakistan's story. I understand that there must be mistakes that were made, but I remember back in 2008-9, Pakistan actually tried to take out a supplement in some of the America's leading newspapers, and that was supplement was to mention Pakistan's sacrifices, and all the publications actually refused to carry that out. I know it because it was happening before my eyes. So we should be telling our story, but is the other side even receptive? And what can we do to improve it?
You have to be persistent. You have to be consistent. You have to keep the narrative same. You have to be truthful, and you have to be engaging. You have to reach out. You cannot do one-time effort and then say that, oh, they did not accept it. Fine. It happens. It does not just happen to Pakistan. I think it happens to many other countries as well. Maybe we are, like for diplomacy, I'm saying strictly in diplomatic terms, for diplomacy, in many areas, it may be a pretty hostile environment for Pakistan. At times, this is not the first time. And remember that this is not the policy of the US government. So, if we are reacting as if it is the policy of the US government, then I think we are mistaken, because it is the thinking of 22 senators. Remember, that the US Congress has 535 members, 100 members of Senate, and 435 members of House of Representatives.
Right.
So out of 100 senators, 22 have come forward from one party, and they think that besides other failures that happened in Afghanistan, America needs to look into the role that Pakistan played. That's fine. I mean, it happens, even though it should not have happened. But that's where I think it's not just the government that has to come forward, like diplomatically, but also your community. Like you have big community organizations here. They interact with the politicians here. They are the ones who can also send across the message that that should be the narrative of Pakistan, not the government of Pakistan. Because when it is the narrative of Pakistan, it means every Pakistani will own it. When it is the narrative of a government, it's not necessary that everybody will agree with it. So that's why I would say that if it is a narrative of Pakistan and it is consistently and persistently, pushed everywhere, it will be heard. When people are active in every sphere, whether it is politics, diplomacy, or at the academic level, or any other level, if you are there and you are just stating what you are, who you are, what you have done, you don't have to overstate anything, and people know it. Like Americans are not born against Pakistan. I don't think so. Like it's like that. But the thing is that yes, false narratives have been there, some truth as well. But how good Pakistan has been in pushing its narrative, I think that's the bigger question.
Right. Khattak Sahab, I understand that currently there are only 22 senators who are actually supporting this bill, and they all are from the opposition. Opposition is usually thought to be the government in waiting, but regardless, there are only 22. The problem then is that given the history and given the history of lobbying that goes on, if a similar number of or a slightly more number of Democrats or further Republicans were to join, it could become a law. It could actually move in that direction. So why would you think that this alarm in Islamabad is misplaced? Because no other country is actually, I understand China and Russia are competitors now, or the way it is perceived, it is big power rivalry. But Pakistan is a country, 20 years, you kept on providing G-locks. Sacrifices are mentioned at the start, and we still continue to suffer. Do you honestly think that one needs only to tell the story, or then one has to lobby as well?
You don't have to stop there. You have to lobby. And also remember that while Pakistan and the US have a long history of cooperation, but they also have a long history of mistrust. There is a level of mistrust always, whether it is from Islamabad or Washington. It has always been there. And that's where Pakistan needs to work, and US also needs to work. Because the US also knows the limits of its influence in the region, and also knows how critical local help and support in terms of policy or any other way is important for the US in order to go after the bad guys who may be still in Afghanistan, and there are plenty there right now. So definitely US will always need Pakistan's support. But Pakistan also has to come out of this cycle of transactional relationship. They have to come,
and that's a very good point. That's a very good point. Allow me to actually go back to Michael Kugelman. Michael, thank you very much for actually waiting for the turn. Let me ask you, this framing of the relationship. In the past, we used to hear that Pakistan is an ally, allied ally at times we heard. But now, whenever we hear people saying India is the ally, Pakistan is somebody we work with. Is this narrative or framing set in stone? I understand that there is an alliance with India, but should it be at the cost of Pakistan? Can there be some emphasis on how important Pakistan has been in the past, and we have worked together as allies?
Well, it's an interesting dynamic because certainly Pakistan has been much more of an ally than India has been to the U.S. in the sense that Pakistan has been an actual ally, right? I mean, there was this counterterrorism alliance that was established after the 9/11 attacks, and it's easy to forget given how downhill the U.S.-Pakistan relationship went in recent years. But the U.S. and Pakistan worked very closely together to apprehend al-Qaeda terrorists in the early months after the 9/11 attacks, and there was a counterterrorism alliance. It was a controversial one, but it was there. Whereas, India does not believe in alliances, so there never has been an alliance between India and the United States, even though the military partnership has grown in a really big way. But to be very candid, the way the geopolitics lines up, the future of U.S.-India relations is just so much brighter than the future for U.S.-Pakistan relations. And the main reason for that is the U.S.-China competition, right? There's bipartisan support here in Washington for the idea of prioritizing the competition with China and dealing with that. And so that entails the U.S.-India relationship growing in a big way because India is viewed as a key partner to enlist in this U.S. effort to counterbalance Chinese power. And given how Pakistan is a close ally of China, that really, I think, renders Pakistan rather irrelevant, to be quite honest, in the context of how the U.S. looks at its relationship with Pakistan vis-a-vis its competition with China. There could be some potential for cooperation between the three, and certainly if you look at an issue like climate change, the U.S. wants to work with China on mitigating climate change risks. Yeah. Why not bring Pakistan into those discussions as well because of its own close relationship with China and its own keen interest in dealing with the climate change issue? But I think that we have to be very realistic that even if we can hope for some degree of stability with U.S.-Pakistan relations, I just don't think there's much potential for broadening that relationship as there is with the U.S.-India relationship. And I think here is where a core disconnect lies in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. And I think I've discussed this before. I mean, I understand that in Pakistan there may be a view toward working with the United States in areas that have nothing to do with Afghanistan, that have nothing to do with China or India, right? Issues like climate change, energy, and so on. But the view is very parochial here in Washington when it comes to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, and the priority continues
regarding
to be
this inevitability of U.S.-India relationship, particularly vis-a-vis China. There must be a reason why the U.S. actually thinks that it should be actually containing China and empowering India. Can you give me that reason? Is it because of democracy? Is it because of something else? Because both countries have a lot of potential. Why is it that it has to be this way?
Right, and to clarify, the U.S. does not want to contain China. I think that the term that's used both in the administration now and the previous administration is countering China. So I think staying away from the Cold War rhetoric is the priority here. But no, it's very simple. The U.S. sees India as a country that is a rival of China. And I mean, that's clearly the major distinction, right? Pakistan is a friend of China's. India is a rival of China's. Why would the U.S. want to enlist Pakistan in any efforts to address the U.S.-China competition, unless the U.S. were to see Pakistan as some type of mediator in that regard? Right. So it really comes down to India's own relationship with China. It certainly comes down to India's geographic location and its size and its own desire to deal with this rising China threat. But to be sure, there's a lot that the U.S. wants to get from India that it has not gotten. One thing being India being able to play the role of a net security provider. That is not something that India can do or has been able to do yet. And that's something that has been a concern for the United States as it moves forward with growing up relationship with
Michael,
India.
I'm told that we have to actually conclude the program here. I'm taking these comments as your conclusion. Let me very quickly ask Brigadier Saab and Khattak Saab also to chip in. If you have one-liner as a conclusion, please go ahead.
Not really one-liner.
Two-liners
have to be discussed in a very deliberate manner.
Yeah, but this is conclusion.
You can, just sprinkle the powder and get away. There's a lot of strategy in what is happening.
Right.
This bill is indicative of many, many things.
Okay.
One is, simple conclusion is, that this is one way of remaining engaged with Pakistan and remain intrusive in Afghanistan. Right? That is one strand that this would ultimately develop into. As regards sanctions on Pakistan, this bill passing will take a long time, long process. It has to be approved by both houses of the Congress, and the simple majority, they would need 218 votes in the House of Representatives.
Right.
Why it has been presented by Senate? Because the Republicans have 50 seats out there, so they already have 2 votes, but then why not all 50 there? So there is a problem. So I don't see this bill getting passing through, and when it comes to Joe Biden, he has all the option on his table. He can veto it, send it back for rediscussion. So let's not overstate this bill, but I would say stay on the middle ground. We have to remain engaged with the US.
And vigilant also.
And we have to convince them about our take on Afghanistan.
Right. Khattak Sahab, your conclusion, sir, very quickly.
Very quickly, Pakistan-US relations for the last more than 4 decades have remained Afghanistan-centric. I see that they will remain Afghanistan-centric in the future as well. The regional realignment is happening, where China is taking a bigger role, Russia is resurgent, and in this region we are seeing a lot of shifts. I don't think so that America will just put Pakistan on the side. It will stay engaged with Pakistan.
Khattak Sahab, on that note, I am told that we have to conclude. Khattak Sahab, thank you very much. Michael Kugelman, thank you very much for your precious time. Brigadier Sahab, Brigadier Salim Kamar Sahab, thank you very much for being with us in the studio. Viewers, you have listened to our participants. This discussion, because the hearings are going on, will continue, but there are 2 aspects which are very important to highlight. This idea of either or, that either Pakistan is China's ally or the US. Pakistan has been doing whatever the US has been asking. Pakistan has been very cooperative, but when it comes to infrastructure damage because of G-locks, you can see what kept on happening, and there was damage over past 20 years. And then China comes in and actually rebuilds it. So one has to ask whether the people you are sacrificing for are actually there for you as well or not. This is one important aspect. The second thing, yesterday and day before yesterday, there was a lot of talk about hidden wounds sustained by the soldiers. I just want to close this program by taking you back to the APS Peshawar incident. When it happened, children were killed in a school, and we all didn't want to send our children back to the school, right? At that time, when the schools opened and I finally sent my children to the school, I sat outside the school in the vehicle waiting for the time when the children will be free to take them back. Why? And my wife actually asked me, if, oh God forbid, terrorists are going to attack, what damage can you do to them? The only submission at that time was that if I cannot fight them properly, I can at least die before some hurt is there for my children. So this is what Pakistan went through in 20 years. You don't belittle that kind of sacrifice. This was today's program. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.